In our previous lessons, we laid the foundations for an MVC component and have set up the database for our data. It's time to start looking at how to manipulate that data, but before we can actually enter the data, we need to list it. To do that, we're going to need a new view to list our messages. Jump into the master controller file. While we already have a view called Hello, I don't really want that to display when a user first comes to the component. I want the list of messages to display. To do that, we can tell the controller which view is the default. Position your cursor above the display method and then look for a snippet called controller set default view. In this snippet, you can add the name of the view that you want to be the default. In our case, I'm going to be building a view called messages, plural, to list all the hello messages in this component. Type that in and add the snippet. Save the file and move to the browser. I'm actually going to navigate you through some of the errors so that when you see them in the future, you'll have a clue as to what they mean and how to fix them. Go to the Hello World component and have a look at what happens. Joomla has thrown a 500 error, which usually means some major problem has occurred. The error says, view not found. What this error means is that Joomla was expecting to find the messages view and a class of hello view messages. If you see that in the future, it can mean that a view folder is misnamed, a view file is misnamed, or the class in the view file is misnamed. Obviously, it didn't find the view because we haven't created it yet, so let's do that. Jump back to your editor and create, under the views folder, a messages folder, then a TMPL folder. Now, under the messages folder, we want to create the view class file, so create a file named view.html.php. Then, under the TMPL folder, we want to create the layout for the view, so create a file called default.php. When you've done that, copy and paste an index.html file into the new folders you just created. Move back into the view.html.php file. Create the PHP header as we've done before. When you've added that, find the snippet called backend Listview. Fill out the package and the subpackage in the normal way. Some of the variables we've come across before. For the name, type in the proper case name of the component without the _ prefix. For the view, type in the name of the view, in our case, messages. The controller_item and controller_list are variables that help tell the MVC which page to return to after a particular operation. For example, when you save and close an edit form, it returns to a list, whereas if you just save an edit form, it will return to the same page. For our case, type in message, that's the singular form, for the controller_item, and messages, that's the plural form, for the controller_list. Finally, for the option variable, type in the name of the component folder, including the _prefix. Let's have a look at what this class does. First, we use the jimport function to include the jview class from which this view class is extended. Next, we declare several protected class properties that will be used by the list. The items property will hold an array of the records that will be displayed in the list. The pagination property will hold an object that helps us display pagination links. The state property will hold an object that holds what we call the state of the model. We'll look at how this is used soon. Now, scroll down a bit and you'll see we've added a custom display method. Remember back when I was explaining about MVC and said how the view would get the data from the model? Well, this is where it happens. The purpose of this display method is to collect all the information from the model and then display the output. We do this by using a very special get method in the view. Let me explain what this does. By the time Joomla gets to the view, the component controller will have already loaded the model and pushed it into the view class. The get method for a class based on JObject usually looks for a class property, but JView's version of the get method is special. The first example shows that we are passing the string items to get. If the view finds that there is a method in the model called getItems, it will execute that method and return the result. If it doesn't find a method in the model, then it will look for a property called items in the view class. Now, I know there actually is a getItems method in the model, so this call is going to assign the result into the items property in the view class. Likewise, the view is asking the model if there is a getPagination method and a getState method, and to assign the results to the pagination and state properties respectively. Next, there are a few lines of code that check if any errors have been registered in the model. The model has a method called getErrors, so we get the result like we did above and check if it's empty. If it's not, we assume that something really bad has happened and raise an error. To do this, we use an object called JError. This has a number of methods that you will come to use over time, like raise_notice or raise_warning, but the one we will use here is raise_error because we want to halt the execution and throw a full error page. I'm sure you've seen them before. The 500 code is used to signify that some sort of system error has occurred. It's always a good idea to return after you raise a hard error like that, because there is a chance that a plugin may be modifying how the raise_error method behaves. Alternatively, you could use exceptions, but how to use them effectively is a topic for another day. So, we're error-free, and the next thing we do in a view for the administrator is set up the toolbar. We've already been introduced to the add toolbar method in a previous lesson, but this one is going to do a bit more work. The first thing it does is initialize some variables. It gets the model state, and you'll remember the $CANDO variable is getting a list of the component permissions available to this user. Next, we add a title to the view using the JToolbarHelperTitle method, as we did in the Hello view. Now it's time to add the main buttons for the list view, which usually includes add, edit, publish, unpublish, archive, delete, trash, and preferences. To display them, we need to test the component permissions. The first button is the add button, and to display, we test the core.create permission and use the add new method in the toolbar helper. The first argument is a task for the controller, and the second argument is the language string that will show under the button in the toolbar. Notice that the task has a dot notation. We'll look at this in more detail in another lesson, but it means that we want that task to be executed in a subcontroller, not the master component controller. So, for a task like message.add, it means that the component will look for a subcontroller called message, and then try to execute the task called add in that subcontroller. Most of the remaining buttons follow a similar principle. For the edit button, we're testing the core.edit permission, and clicking it will set the task to message.edit. The publish, unpublish, and archive buttons can be handled in one block by testing the core.edit.state permission, but the task is set to reflect the required action. Notice that the subcontroller here is not message. This time it uses messages. The reason for this is to split actions that happen to a list of records from actions that happen to single records. For example, you only edit one record at a time. So we use an item subcontroller named in the singular form. Publishing can happen on a list of records, so we set the task with what we call a list subcontroller named in the plural form. Next, we have a block for the trash and delete buttons. You can see that we're testing the core.delete permission to show the delete button and the core.edit.state permission to show the trash button. But you can also see another check against something called filter.published. There are two things to note here. The first is that the user interface tries to make it easy to put records in the trash, but difficult to delete records permanently in order to avoid unfortunate accidents. We only allow the delete button to show when the list is filtered on the trash setting. This is where the model state comes in. When we get to the model, we'll see that it will be aware of several filters, one being the state of the published database table field. The state object is derived from the JObject class, so our old friend the get method is available, and we just need to test whether the list filter for the published state is set to -2. If it is, and the user has permission, then we show the delete button. Finally, we test the core.admin permission to see if the component options button is to be shown. We've covered a fair bit of ground, but we're only part of the way. In the next lesson, we'll add the model. See you back real soon.